This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Welcome to the House of Wisdom, Ahval's podcast for book talks on the Middle East and more. My guest today is Ahmet Kuru, who is Bruce Porteous Professor of Political Science at San Diego State University. He was a postdoctoral scholar at Columbia University and the author of Secularism and State Policies Toward Religion, the United States, France, and Turkey, which received the book award for the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion. He is also the co-editor of Democracy, Islam, and Secularism in Turkey. His most recent book by Cambridge University Press, Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment, a global and historical comparison, received great attention and already translated into 8 languages. The book asks why Muslims, once world leaders in art, science, and military power, suffer from inferiority in the modern era. Professor Kuru, congratulations on the book and welcome to the House of Wisdom.
Thanks for having me.
It's not uncommon to ask big questions, but it's surely uncommon to hunt them down with a book project. So I'm not going to ask where you got this question, as why were we left behind is a question that is commonly asked in tea and coffee houses across the Muslim world. But I'm wondering, how did you find the courage to produce an academic book when you're sure to know you will be attacked from multiple fields?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for your courage to have the interview, because you'll be attacked by multiple fields. So for me, the answer is that this is primarily a personal project. I didn't write the book to have academic promotion because I already was a professor with tenure. I didn't write it to earn money because you don't earn money by writing academic books. I primarily wrote it to answer my own questions, dozens of questions in my mind since my childhood. In addition to leaving a legacy to my children and others who have these questions or will have these questions. Therefore, in fact, I dedicated the book to my late father and my children, saying that I wish my father could have read it, and I hope my children will read it one day in the future, inshallah. So that's the personal aspect. And therefore, I didn't really pay attention what others will say. The second thing is that definitely I see the ongoing debate, and it is a very polarizing debate from the Middle East to the West, from the policy circles, as you said, on the daily life, people on the street and coffee houses, to the academia. It is polarized in a way that one camp blame Islam. We can call them Orientalist, Islamophobe, or essentialists. And they have a monocausal argument blaming Islam. The other camp, in general, sometimes even deny the problem itself. They question what democracy is, what development is. These are all Western concepts. Even asking question for them is imposing a Western agenda. Or they just blame Western imperialism and colonization. So for me, to engage with this debate is important to really defend a middle ground, giving some credits to both camps, but at the same time criticizing them and providing an alternative. And while doing so, of course, both sides are ready to criticize, but so far in the last 2 years, the book has received mostly positive attention. Out of 70 and more reviews, of course, some of them are very critical, But in both academia and the media, many readers have found out certain sympathetic arguments, certain arguments that make sense to them, from Sunni Muslim to Shia Muslim to non-Muslims. I think that's important, that there is a debate, and my book tries to make a contribution. So these were my motivations, basically.
Yeah, you reject the main explanations, two main explanations, I need to say, on why Muslims were left behind. These explanations are colonization thesis, the first one, which points out colonialism's bitter legacy as the main driver. And as you mentioned, Islam's exceptionalism thesis that perceives Islam as essentially incompatible with modern sciences. And as an alternative, you put the two social forces to the fore. And they are the independent scholars, ulama, but independent scholars, and merchants class. And how did you arrive this conclusion to look at these two social forces, and what was your conclusion?
So when we examine the two established arguments, and throughout my book, each and every chapter, I give them some credits. For example, I document the destruction of colonial empires in the Muslim world, from history to present, Western interventions, how they lead to violence and certain level of institutional collapse, what the numbers of slavery, exploitation in Americas and elsewhere. But at the same time, I said that chronologically, when Western colonization started, Muslims already had intellectual and economic stagnation. Normatively, just focusing on Western imperialism would really cover up Muslims' domestic problems. And these are the reasons, in fact, I really put aside the argument. And even comparatively, we see that in Asia, in Latin America, many post-colonial countries achieve democracy and or economic growth. Why not in the Middle East or some other parts of the Western world? That's the question need to be asked. About the Islam debate, those who just blame Islam are wrong, because I show and document in my book, and many others did before, that for 5 to 6 centuries, between 8 to 11 or 12 centuries, Muslims had, quote unquote, a golden age of science and economy. Many terms we use in English, starting with AL, like algorithm, algebra, even alcohol, are terms borrowed from Arabic, and the Muslim polymaths, scholars with multiple fields and experiences, contribute from physics to medical sciences, from mathematics to philosophy. And therefore, Islam was perfectly compatible. And in fact, it was a motivation and inspiration for progress. Even today, the Muslim world shows a variation from their constitutions. I have a list of them and analysis in my book, that there are secular constitutions and Sharia-based constitutions and mixed one, to economic regimes. Some of them are rentier, some of them are not, to political systems. And this variation should not be neglected by essentialist arguments blaming Islam. But at the same time, I'm proposing a class-based argument, as you noted. Very briefly, 4 classes: scholarly class, economic class, religious class, and political class. The relationship between the 4 are very important. Between 8 to 11 centuries, the scholarly class in the Muslim world, which include both Islamic scholars, we call ulema, like Abu Hanifa and other founders of Sunni mazhabs, and Jafar Sadiq and other Shia ulema. They were important contributors of the Golden Age, as well as Muslim philosophers and non-Muslim philosophers, Christian, Jews, agnostics. They all contributed a very brilliant civilization that brought together multiple cultures, ethnic backgrounds, and religious and philosophical beliefs. And at that time, during the Muslim achievement between 8th to 11th centuries, Western Europe was backward. Western Europe was dominated by the Catholic clergy-state alliance. Western Europe did not have intellectual and economic classes that contribute its positions and conditions. But somehow in the 11th century, a reversal began. Western Europe started to have universities, states, and institutionalization of church-state separation, which led to the rise of dynamic economic and intellectual classes, which eventually led many revolutions and progress in Europe. Whereas the Muslim world, starting with the 11th century, experienced the emergence of an alliance between the ulama and the state, which eventually marginalized philosophers and independent Islamic scholars, as well as the merchants, that led to economic and scientific stagnation in the Muslim world. But of course, things didn't change overnight in the 11th century. It took almost 5 centuries, from 11 to 16, for Europe really caught up with the Muslim world and surpassed. It was only 17th century that Europe scientifically and economically really started to surpass the Muslim world. For about 5 centuries, between 11 and 16, both regions had comparable levels of development. And therefore, I want to emphasize that during these centuries, Muslims still produce very important thinkers such as Ibn Rushd and Ibn Khaldun. But these philosophers during this post-11th century era were mostly neglected in the case of Ibn Khaldun, or sometimes attacked by ulema state alliance or bigots, like the case of Ibn Rushd, whose very important book on Plato's Republic today is extant only in Hebrew translation because its Arabic original was destroyed. So this is the story based on class relations, which makes me and many readers hopeful about the future, because when we need a reform to separate religion and state to a certain extent and make each and every spheres of life autonomous, Islam doesn't reject it. Islam has already a historical experience of certain level of separation and autonomy of each spheres. And what we see today is basically class relations and domination of ulema-state alliance is the source of the problems.
This is a great introduction, because I like to ask a couple of questions about, you touched upon a number of things, and I like to ask in-depth questions, starting from the independence. So independent scholars, your book mentions Sunni schools of jurisprudence, these 4 big imams, Abu Hanifa and others. They were independent scholars who refused to work as state servants. And as a consequence, they were imprisoned by the rulers who claimed to be caliphs or the leaders of Ummah. Can we say that this tension had a positive outcome with the evolution of checks and balances? Islamic scholars gained popular respect for their independent thinking, and Muslim publics turned to these scholars instead of caliphs in matters of faith. So can we claim that in most cases, the state elite could not unite the both secular and religious realm under their control?
Very good question. In fact, you captured some important arguments in the book very effectively. First of all, this is an unintended consequence, because the founders of Umayyad dynasty, Muawiyah, then Yazid, then Marwan, they did not intend to start an intellectually and economically dynamic civilization by really triggering religion-state separation. They wanted to dominate. As you say, they claimed to be caliph, so did the Abbasi caliphs. But unintentionally, when the Umayyad founders, persecuted the Prophet's family, publicly murdered Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, and then secretly murdered Hassan, the other grandson, it became a disenchantment for many Sunni and Shia scholars and some masses that politicians are really corrupt, not trustworthy. Therefore, in order to be moral, scholars, Islamic scholars, and pious people should put a distance between themselves and the ruling class. This really dominated the Muslim mindset for many centuries. In 1970 article, Cohen brought together important numerical data. He analyzes 3,900 ulama between 8th to mid-11th century and showing details that 92% of them were, or 91% of them, were funded by private sectors. Themselves or their families had private jobs, mostly related to commerce, but there is a long list of jobs they were performing, including barber, including porter carrying items, etc. And Abu Hanifa was a silk merchant. Ibn Hanbal worked in textile sector. Only 9%, a minority among the ulama until the mid-11th century, work as officials, including qadi, judges. And even theoretically, Ibn Hanbal declared that receiving money from state haram, forbidden. As you said, Abu Hanifa stood up and refused to accept judgeship. Therefore, he was imprisoned and poisoned to death. So that was very important because although philosophers like Farabi, Ibn Sina received state patronage, it was not as crucial as ulemas receiving state patronage after the 11th century. Because when before the 11th century, philosophers received money from the state, they did not declare any group apostates, they did not establish a religious orthodoxy, and they did not sacralize the ruling class, because philosophers did not have mass support and didn't have the ability to justify using religion what the rulers did. But after the mid-11th century, with Nizamiya madrasas, with the transformation of ulama as a state servant class, they helped the ruling class to declare dissenting opinions as blasphemy and apostasy. They established a Sunni orthodoxy in the Seljuk, Ayyubi, Mamluk, Ottoman empires, or a Shia orthodoxy in the Safavi Empire. And they justify political decisions by using religion. That's the problem after the mid-11th century. Therefore, what you said was important in a way that after the establishment of the Umayyads until the mid-11th century, there was many centuries of diversity, dynamism, as a result of an unintended consequence, but also as a result of the fact that Islam did not impose a particular political program. But after the mid-11th century, when the ulama wanted to justify their partnership with political class, they fabricated a hadith saying that religion and state are twins. Religion is the foundation, state is the guardian, that without foundation collapse, that within the guardian perishes. But in fact, I documented in my book that this is a Sasanian maxim, nothing to do with the Prophet Muhammad, salam, and this fabricated hadith was needed because they couldn't find anything in the Islamic text to justify their partnership. And in fact, some of the post-11th century ulama, like the towering figure Ghazali, the most important of them, had a personal experience that he regret to have close relations with politicians. Around the age of 40, he went to the graveyard of Prophet Abraham and took an oath that he would never receive money from the rulers again. He would never teach their madrasas again, and he would never join to the debate majlis, the gatherings of the ruling class again. So even Ghazali, who on the one hand supported the Ulama State Alliance Sunni Orthodoxy with some writings, still provide a critical stand about the partnership between the ulama and the state, which brings us a legacy even today.
Yeah, I like to, again, let's come to the 11th century developments, looking closer as you see these detrimental developments to early collaboration of scholars and merchants. First, your book says the military class took over the economy by appropriating land revenues, and therefore they began to weaken merchants. And secondly, as you mentioned, the Ulama State Alliance was born in the Seljuk Empire. In particular, you analyzed the state-sponsored Nizamiye madrasas that consolidated Sunni orthodoxy against the threats of dangerous thoughts, and Muslim scholars increasingly become state servants. The Crusaders and the Mongol invasions exacerbated the trend. The state was seen as a protector of religion, and Islam was used to legitimize the ruling regime. So in this picture, I see medieval version of the national security discourse. So would you like to please elaborate on that?
This is a very good point. And you mentioned so many things that it will be very difficult for the listeners to really digest. But let me just elaborate on some of the very important points you mentioned. First of all, your analogy is absolutely right, that the notion of security or the instrumentalization of security is crucial. Because as you know, there is one thing is the real existential security threat, material and imminent one. And the usage of it as a discourse, as a perception, is a different thing. And in the Muslim world, we saw both after the mid-11th century. On the one hand, yes, there was physical threat coming from east, the Mongols, and then from the west, the Crusaders. Mongols in particular killed millions, massacred urban people in Central Asia all the way to the gates of Damascus. That was a tragedy and trauma. It very much make the Ulama State Alliance strengthened. And it reproduced it in new areas, because in the 11th century, the Seljuk Empire, when they established Ulama State Alliance, it was a multi-causal, multi-layer transformation. As you referred to, it had economic, ideological / religious, and political / military reasons. From history to present, the concept of Ulama State Alliance is very complex. Today, some of my critics says, how can you explain such major question of underdevelopment and authoritarianism in the Muslim world with a single cause, basic concept of Ulama State Alliance? My answer is that Ulama State Alliance is a very complex phenomenon. Historically, it began with an economic crisis that changed the old system. In the 10th and 11th centuries, there was an economic decline linked to declining agricultural production, especially in the Iraqi fields, which forced the Abbasi ruling class to embrace the Iqta system, a semi-feudal system of land distribution, in order to pay the salaries of the officials, particularly military officials, because of the scarcity of money. This Iqta system was later on became more institutionalized by the Shia Buyuts who control certain parts of Iraq and today's Iran. When Seljuks came to power and dominate Iraq, the Iqta system of semi-feudal land distribution was already well known, and it was already replacing the old Muslim economic system based on money and market. And the Seljuks make it even more institutionalized, which led to state control over the economy. This marginalized private landowners and weakened the financial abilities of the merchants. And then when merchants became financially troubled, who would sponsor the scholars? The state jumped in, particularly the Seljuk Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, and initiate a chain of madrasas indirectly sponsored by the Seljuk dynasty, Abbasi Caliph dynasty, and the bureaucratic families like Nizam al-Mulk family. It's called the Nizamiya Madrasa system. Although they were funded by endowments, these endowments were mostly political. And it creates a new class of ulama who were prone to be partners of the state in governance. So this is the economic dimension. Very briefly, let me emphasize the ideological and religious dimension. In the 11th century, Shia dynasties like Fatimids in North Africa, Karamatis in Arabian Peninsula, Hamdanis in Syria, Buyuts in Iran and Iraq dominate North Africa and the Middle East. Abbasi caliphs in Baghdad remain very symbolic. In reaction, Caliph Qadir, then his son Qaim, declare a Sunni ultimatum and Sunni creed, declaring certain Shias, philosophers, and Mu'tazili, the rationalist theologians, and non-practicing Muslims as infidels, punishable by death, in order to unify Sunnis. And this Sunni creed and call was well received by the Seljuks. That was the religious/ideological dimension of the emergence of ulama state alliance against Shias, philosophers, Mu'tazilis, and non-practicing Muslims. Finally, as you mentioned, military dimension was very important because Seljuks were a nomadic warrior group of people, and ruling state brought the idea of conquest rather than commerce-based taxation, commerce-based state governance. It was a military notion. And they used the Iqta system to fund the military commanders. They used the Sunni creed to punish the enemies. And they used the military structure, designing state as an army. At this point, as you refer rightly, the Mongols and Crusaders played an important role because when in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, Muslims faced the massacres by the Mongols Crusaders, they need military heroes. When you see massacre, you no longer ask for good arts, music, science, and philosophy. You ask for military protection. And the military protection came in the form of Saladin, who saved Jerusalem from Crusaders, gave birth to Ayyubi dynasty, which produced the Mamluk dynasty. And then the Mamluks stopped the Mongols, the Mongol invasion of Egypt, and they became heroes in the Muslim world. With this military credit, they ruled Egypt for centuries. That's the way how Mongol and Crusader invasions really reproduced and strengthened ulama state alliance, which made the military mentality and security mentality at the center of Muslim socio-political life. And the ulama partnership was important to justify conquest, military decisions, And the military leader allowed the ulama in exchange, because that was a really reciprocal relationship between military state and the ulama. Ulama justify military state provide money, positions, and ability to dominate, monopolize Islam. So ulama receive a position where they have the monopoly to interpret Islam. The Selçuk model, therefore, moved to Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and the rest of the Muslim world. That's why the post-11th century thinkers, as I mentioned, like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Khaldun, were produced in the West, Spain, Tunisia, because the East already dominated by ulama state alliance. And after Mongols and Crusaders came three empires, Ottoman, Safavi, and Mughal. The Ottomans really reproduced and more institutionalized the Selçuk model, whereas Safavis established a Shia version of ulama state alliance. And these empires show that Muslims after Mongol and Crusaders politically and militarily recover, but they couldn't recover philosophically and even economically because of the ulama state alliance.
So you mentioned such an alliance between the religious class and the state was also an outcome of the Persian influence. The Sasanian thought of the twin brotherhood, religion, and the kingdom. This tight interconnection was wrongly attributed to Prophet Muhammad. So apparently it was an invention in religion, bid'ah. But that contradiction was, the ulama didn't see that bid'ah as a problem when it's coming from the Persian culture, whereas they were quite alert against Muslims who flirted with the Greek philosophical thoughts. And another contradiction was that the ulama did not embrace Ghazali's liberal or pluralistic ideas as much as they embraced his conservative ideas. For example, Ghazali claimed that the eternal salvation of the Byzantine Christians may be possible. So how can we explain all these contradictions?
A very good question. You know, we social scientists deal with the major chicken and egg problem about the ideas and structural factors. And there is no answer to this inherent question, which comes first. I think ideas and structural or material conditions are interconnected. Yes, ideas matter, but which idea becomes more important than the others really related to its connection to power relations, material interest, institutional decisions. So starting with your last question, for example, Ghazali was a genius, very productive, very knowledgeable and inspirational figure. But many of his ideas were neglected. As you mentioned, he said that Byzantine Christians can go to heaven and have eternal salvation, but this idea was dropped, was not embraced by the mainstream ulama. But some of his ideas, like the ulama state alliance, etc., was pick up, and his criticism of philosophers particularly pick up, and his declaration that philosophers can be defined apostate for three reasons was emphasized, although it's just one page at the end of his Tahafut al-Falasifa, the inconsistency of philosophers, because certain ideas fit to ulama state alliance, fit the power relations, fit the interest of the military class, were emphasized. Similar answer to your first question, certain Persian ideas, particularly Sasani notion of governance, was emphasized by many, especially Nizam al-Mulk. He himself wrote Siyasetname with a really Sasani framework and defining the ruling class, especially the king, as almost a holy figure, and religion and state, the twin brothers again. And and then ideas you see that nothing to do with Islam, but mostly Persian governance principles. But why were they so tolerant to them instead of Greek philosophy? And let me just emphasize some points. One is that Greek philosophy was coming with metaphysics, a metaphysical theory. The idea of material world is eternal and some other related claims that really compete the Muslim metaphysics. That was one problem. The Sassanians did not have such metaphysical claim. The second thing is that Islam, when Islam emerged, there were two major empires, the Sasani and Byzantium, Eastern Rome. Muslims only conquered some territories of Eastern Rome. And those territories were already Arabic, Aramaic. They were not representing the authentic Greek lifestyle theory and practice. But in the case of Sasani, Muslims conquest the entire Sasani Empire and make it a part of the Muslim world. Therefore, the Sasani ideas and Persian language became a domestic internal part of the Muslim Empire, whereas the Greek already represented by a foreign enemy in Constantinople. It was the other, it was not part of the system. So that was the advantage of Persian ideas, that there were many Persian-speaking, formerly Sasani, newly converted Muslims, but they were still representing the old mindset and injecting it to the Muslim theory. It wasn't the case for the Eastern Rome. That was the difference, I think.
Great insights. Your findings show parallels between the post-11th century and the post-19th century periods when external military threats led to the securitization of religious discourse and the domination of the state elites over intellectuals. As you note in your book, modern secularist leaders in the Muslim majority nations were often former military officers who had authoritarian views to control over the economy by restricting the intellectuals and bourgeoisie classes. More importantly, the secularist rulers were ambitious to use the religious institutions for the regime's legitimacy, and they created their malleable ulama class. Similar to their secular counterparts, when we look at the Islamic actors in the modern era, whether trained in madrasas or Sufi sheikhs and or Islamists, they all have shared bias toward both intellectuals and the bourgeoisie. So the overall picture looks like an unresolvable paradox, isn't it?
Yes and no. Yes, it is a difficult paradox because, as you noted, after the 18th century, Muslim rulers realized the problem. They were defeated by the Western European armies and realized that Western Europeans had better schools, better institutions in terms of effective government. In the 19th century, therefore, from Egypt's Muhammad Ali Pasha to Ottoman's Mahmud II, they initiated reform by sidelining ulama and abolishing the old military elite Janissaries in Istanbul and the Mamluks in Egypt, who were in fact partners of the ulama. When the Janissaries and Mamluks were gone, ulama became politically weaker. But still, the reform movements were not very successful. Neither was the 20th century, early 20th century secularist reform movements, from Turkey's Atatürk to Egypt's Nasser to Tunisia's Habib Bourguiba. There were some success, of course, but not very impressive achievements, revolutionary way. The main reason I argue is that, interestingly, these seemingly revolutionary cadres and their reform movements were in fact continuity of historical domination of the state, especially the military class. Yes, they sidelined the ulama, but filled the gap with bureaucrats, military and civilian bureaucrats. And their inspirations from Europe include many socialist and fascist ideas Socialism was key in Arab nationalism and Nasserism. We didn't see a democratic or, let's say, more open-minded systems and ideologies that encourage the rise of an intellectual class and a bourgeois class. In the Ottoman Empire, some intellectuals emerged like young Ottomans and some Western educated elite in Egypt, but they never had the chance to shape politics. And some bourgeoisie in the late Ottoman era, mostly supported by Western countries, therefore the ruling Muslim elite regarded that bourgeoisie as a fifth column of Europe, not local authentic bourgeoisie, but supported by Europe. Therefore, always a tension between this non-Muslim bourgeoisie in the late Ottoman, early Republican era and the state, which is obsessed with controlling everything. And it came to today, and what to do today? Today, many ulama state alliances are vibrant. Even in secular states like Turkey, they are now very effective. Because in the late 20th century, early 21st century, ulama state alliances re-emerge in many Muslim countries with the motivation either coming from top-down or bottom-up. Top-down means that the state rulers want to justify their regimes, mostly authoritarian, by using Islam. Nasser made the Sheikh of Al-Azhar a political appointee, and then other presidents of Egypt until today have tried to use Al-Azhar and other Islamic institutions to justify their regimes. That's the top-down. But there was also bottom-up motivations, popularity of Islamists, the failure of secularists, and the continuing legitimacy of ulama to interpret religion led to the revolution in Iran and many other transformations in Afghanistan, Sudan, and elsewhere, and to a lesser degree in many Muslim countries. And Islamization brought really the post-11th century ulama state alliance, putting Sharia into their constitutions, emphasizing Sharia courts in family matters and other matters. Where is the money coming from? In most cases, money is coming from rents. Historically, it was iqta system and rent revenues. Today, it's mostly oil rents or canal fees or selling lands and making constructions. Even in Turkey, which is oil poor, there is rent-seeking regime. Now, Tayyip Erdoğan's regime is trying to build a canal in Istanbul. What is the main point? The main point is seeking rent. Canal fees like the Suez Canal, building residencies, malls, and other constructions in both sides of the canal and selling it, making rent. But rentierism doesn't have a future, because oil age will end before the end of oil, as stone age ends before the end of stones. There will be new technologies, at least the depletion of reserves, increasing consumption at homes, shrinking the money coming from exportation of oil. So Muslim countries desperately need a rethinking in the future, in the post-oil era. They will need a restructuring of their economies. When the economy restructure, this religion-state relationship will also definitely need to change, because neither ulama nor state is productive classes, and they use oil rents and other rents to fund them. But in order to have a long-term economic growth, you need an economic entrepreneur class, and you need an open society. Therefore, you need to allow freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and intellectual class to grow, to have innovation, to have competition. In a nutshell, definitely my criticism of the ulama state alliance and rentierism from history to present calls for a reform, a restructuring. And this reform is not a simply intellectual ideal. It is, in fact, an economic necessity that Muslims need to really respond. I recently watched the video interview of MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Even MBS emphasized that Saudi Arabia needs tourism money. Saudi Arabia cannot impose strict Sharia laws. They should follow human rights principles, otherwise tourists will not come. So even the most rentier state, the deep Sharia and ulama state alliance, realized that economic necessities is forcing them to change.
Your book is so rich in its discussions, so it's possible to read it from a secularist perspective, to blame the ulama for the crisis, while another reader may perceive the militarized states as the main problem. Of course, the complex alliance of the ulama and state was experienced differently in various degrees in the vast geography and time span. So both perspectives may find some support from your argumentation. In my read, I joined the camp who see the militarized state elites as the problem rather than ulama. Let me elaborate. I found your arguments more convincing when it depicts a structural breakdown that fed insecurity in Muslim societies. And as a consequence, they were seeking conformity and social order. The culture of insecurity, for example, could explain how Sunni orthodoxy approached the issue of apostasy. Islamic scholars recognized discretionary authority of political leaders in defining who posed a threat to social order and national security. An apostate was the modern equivalent of terrorist or a traitor who joined the enemy. Although some Sunni scholars believed that such discretionary authority was helpful to separate state sphere and the religious sphere, the ruling elite have gathered extraordinary opportunity to exploit the religious verdicts for the regime's interests. In other words, under highly securitized contexts, the conditions are never conducive for ulama's positive contributions. It may be possible to witness some ulama who dare to resist the state and pay the heavy price as an outcome, but it would be very utopian to expect such brave acts should become the norm of everyday life across time and space. Also, the state's ability to crush the opposition has dramatically increased in the modern era. So simply, state is extraordinarily privileged and powerful in its interactions with religion. And perhaps Muslims from now on, and after the failure of Islamism today, they may discover, I hope, that secularism to a certain extent will be savior of Islam from the whims of the state rulers. So what do you think?
I should write a book to answer your question, but let me touch upon some of the very important points you mentioned. First of all, I agree with you that structural conditions, especially the military state and authoritarian state in particular, are important conditions to really shape the ulama, and the state even produce certain institutions to shape the ulama's mindset and education, madrasas from history to present, under state control to a certain extent. So this is the problem. And the security threat, as I said, there was some real one, but it didn't continue centuries. It was used as a discourse, the perception, even today. The state, the military state, always exaggerate the security threat to rule the people in its direction. That's one thing. The second thing is that ulama is responsible. So my book clearly is not calling a witch hunt against ulama, because it appreciates ulama, especially pre-11th century ulama. But even after the post-11th century, today, for example, there are many exceptions in the Muslim world. Ulama in Indonesia show certain level of diversity. Two major groups, Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, have contributed to democracy in Indonesia. Even Islamists in Tunisia show that they can contribute to democratization. Sufis in Senegal is another example of pro-democratic Islamic actors. But overall, ulama really need an autocriticism. even in Turkey, even on the crucial problem of the printing press, it is very difficult to convince ulama that they were responsible for the delay of embracing printing technology for 300 years. Because it was the ulama who didn't give the permission. Then after 300 years, they only gave the permission for printing non-religious books. 50 years later, they allowed religious books to print it, but not the Quran. 50 years later, they allowed the Arabic Quran be printed in Ottoman printing press, but not a translation. So therefore, Turks need to wait the Republic in 1924 to see, finally, a Turkish translation of the Quran was printed. So ulama had a responsibility. When they accept that, we can go ahead and move ahead. Then the ulama can change its ideas. Let me make a comparison with the Catholic Church. I am sure they will not be happy with this comparison. But the Catholic Church is taking responsibility, sometimes apologizing, making declaration of change, having the Vatican Council II, 1964, embracing democracy and human rights. On the issue of apostasy laws you mentioned, for example, ulama is best, they are silent. They wait. Who fill the gap? Radical groups like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda. Because ulama is so afraid of making reforms, changing ideas. But as you mentioned, they don't even criticize bid'ahs like Sasani ideas, but we see many double standards. So therefore, my second point is that, yes, authoritarian state forced them to do things, but at the same time, senior ulama is very conservative. For example, in Egypt, in 1925, a young junior alim, member of ulama class, Ali Abdelrazik, wrote an important book saying that Islam is not a political religion. When the Prophet died, he didn't even leave a political successor. Therefore, the idea of caliphate is historical construction. The ulama of LSR council, the senior members, came together, cancel his degree, make him Ali Abdelrazik, the young scholar, alim, make him unemployed, and remove all his degrees to punishment. So this is the level of openness. Let's bring this historical example to today. Turkey. In 2013, during the Gezi protests in Istanbul and other cities against the Erdogan's project of construction and rent seeking, there was the claim by the government that some protesters drank beer in a mosque. Then the imam of the mosque, as a member of the ulama class, was a moral person. And he said, no, I cannot tell a lie. There was no one drinking beer in my mosque. What happened? Did other ulama support him? No. When the government punished this honest man, put him in exile in a different distant village or distant place, all other ulama were silent. So this is the problem that I pinpoint and try to emphasize. So last but not least, about the future, what to do. I think being critical is really helpful in the Muslim world, because when a doctor sees a patient, the doctor is supposed to be honest and tell the problems. We as social scientists, our job is not to cover up. Our job is to honestly tell what we see. But of course, pushing people to pessimism is not a good way. There are many reasons to be optimistic about the future. First of all, the state structure, the military state, etc., is able to transform, as we see in Western countries. The original French state, British state, American state, basically, as Max Weber, defined the state itself as an organization that monopolized the use of violence in a given territory. So this is a violent institution, but it has been domesticated, contained, To some extent, in many cases, why not in the Muslim world, we can see it. The ulama, as I said, even Ghazali, with some partnership with the ruling class, gave us a legacy. In Ihya Ulumuddin, his very famous multi-volume book, Ghazali repeatedly asked scholars to stand up against immoral, corrupt rulers and not to justify corruption. Therefore, the teaching is still there. And many ulama members are very well known. It didn't stop in 11th century. Until today, there is this idea that in terms of morality, in terms of ethical values, the ulama should be autonomous, represent what is right rather than what is mighty. But the practice is the problem. Theory, I think there is a good theory that makes us hopeful about the future. And last but not least, as I noted, the economic conditions are changing. They are asking a real transformation, restructuring, reform. I think Muslims, for such a reform, and in the Arabic word, etc., they say nahda renaissance, for a renaissance, they don't really need to imitate Western models. They don't need a French-type laïcité secularism. But Muslims can really reproduce an open society, dynamic intellectual life, productive economic life. And for doing so, we really need separation of academia, economy, politics, religion, arts, sports, in order to make each of them respectful. Combination or mixture of them creates corruption. If an academic uses political and economic reasons in her grading, publication, we call it corruption. If a religious leader uses political reason in her religious opinion, it's corruption. For justice, for productivity, we really need that each of these spheres are autonomous. Of course, they may have exchanges. Of course, they may inspire each other. Of course, some overlapping is possible, but autonomy, differentiation, and certain level of separation is what we need today. And in my first book, in fact, I said passive secularism. You asked whether secularism is the solution. Let me conclude by that, saying that yes, secularism is needed for universal citizenship, where Muslim and non-Muslim are equal citizens, where lawmaking is done by people's participation, not just by the ulama, where we have a checks and balance system you refer at the beginning, not a Mawardi type caliph ruling for life without checks and balance, not Ibn Taymiyyah type ulama state alliance without checks and balance. No, we did a democratic state with checks and balances and separation of powers. That's why we need secularism. But what kind of secularism? A French type laïcité or assertive secularism that was tried in Turkey, Tunisia, and some Central Asian republics meant state control of religion and other spheres. And it is ineffective and leading to domination. We need a passive secularism. In a way, the state plays a passive role, creating a sphere of diversity, tolerating secular and religious lifestyle symbols. And in that kind of secular passive notion, we have separation of spheres, and religion can flourish. The ulama then can become really like Abu Hanifa. Then they can preach what is moral rather than what is politically truth. That's the idea and hope. Thank you.
Professor Kuru, it's a pleasure speaking with you. I learned a lot from your book, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. House of Wisdom is full of wise questions and inspirational ones. Thank you.
Thanks.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.